This is part 16 of my series on my N-gauge model railway project. Earlier parts provided an intro to the project and my background with the railways and covered initial setup of the baseboard, selection and laying of track, various scenic items from Metcalfe, Kestrel, Ratio and P&D Marsh kits and built from foam, etc. A review of my period LMS and LNER rolling stock, installing and weathering a Kato motorized turntable, adding more sidings to the layout, some adjustments to the track involving customization of Kato Unitrack sections, and adding another loco shed extension to the turntable. A couple of recent parts also showed some actual video of running on the layout. This part goes back to dealing with scenic bits, mostly station lights, but also a couple of other odd trackside items, a loading gauge, a water crane, and some signals. I bought 2 sets of Ratio station light kits, each making 4 lights. I picked these up with a whole bunch of other stuff some time ago from British model trains in Cambridge, Ontario, and I figured the time had finally come to assemble them. I wasn't looking forward to this given my experience with other Ratio kits. Ratio makes some well-manufactured parts, but their expectations in terms of how things should be assembled tend to be ludicrous, and their N-gauge kits are just impossibly fiddly, very hard to handle without breakage and with parts so tiny they blow away if you breathe too hard. I did my best with these lamp kits to minimize the likelihood of parts loss and to ease handling. I determined to do as much assembly as possible with parts still attached to the sprues. Here you can see that I have put the posts onto the lamp heads with the heads still on their sprues. I've also painted the corners of the lamp heads. What you're seeing here is that I have cut the little spikes that go on top of the lamps from the black sprues, and then I have glued those little spikes, which are very small, onto the tops of the pieces for the top of the heads, with those head pieces still attached to the sprues. So you can see several spikes here, and those spikes are on the head tops that came originally as separate parts. Now what I was doing here was gluing the little platforms for the tops of the ladders to the lamps. It turned out that I was doing this wrong. The instructions are just a diagram, and it makes it look as though the platforms go together like this, and that also seems a sensible way to attach them, as there's actually something to attach them to in this position. But actually they're supposed to float some way part down the shafts, with just their edges glued to the thin post, which is a typical piece of Ratio unreasonable assembly expectation. If they put a groove into the post, or a notch in the platforms, or a bracket underneath, any of those would make the assembly more feasible, but Ratio just don't do that kind of thing to help you assemble their kits. Here's another view of how I attached the platforms in the wrong position, where I could glue them to the base plates of the heads. The platforms still have their sprue connections on them. I did that on purpose to make them a little bigger and easier to handle. I can always trim the sprue connections off after the glue has dried. And here I have trimmed the pieces off and trimmed the platforms down, trying to be as clever as I could, but getting it wrong, since they're not actually supposed to go there. Now finally I took the partially assembled lamps off from the sprue for the translucent heads. Now I balanced the black sprues on the edge of an old cassette tape so that the spiked lamp tops hung down over the edge, and glued the lamps onto their spiked tops. Polyglue won't work for this, as the translucent heads are some different kind of plastic. The Ratio instructions say to use Evo stick. No such thing exists where I live. I looked it up. Apparently it's a brand of the Bostik company, which they use for a variety of glues they sell in the UK. Since the brand is apparently used for a variety of glues, the instruction really wasn't much help in telling me what kind of glue to use. I just used cyanoacrylate superglue. Next I clipped the largely assembled lamps out from the black sprues where they were all still attached. I also clipped out the ladders. I had trouble clipping these out without breaking them, as they were so fragile, and I did in fact break several, repairing them as best I could with liquid polyglue. I painted the bases for the lamps grey before gluing on the lamps themselves. It was at this point, when I went to attach the ladders, that I realised I'd put the platforms for the tops of the ladders in the wrong place. But they were very firmly glued in place, so I just went ahead and put the ladders up against the posts themselves. So all of these lamps are actually assembled wrongly, but I can live with them. Now I tried putting them in place on the station. I wanted to use them for my main Colville station. I wasn't all that happy with the way they looked on the platform. They seemed rather large and overcomplicated and to take up too much space. I really think I prefer the effect of using the much simpler P&D Marsh white metal lamps. Here's a picture showing a direct comparison between the two. I suppose there's something to be said for both. I did go ahead with placing all of the ratio lamps on the Colville station, though I'm still not sure if I'm happy with the effect. Whilst I was working on station lights, I put 2 of the P&D Marsh white metal lamps onto the Bilston Holt platform, which is cardboard built from the Metcalfe stone platform kit. And here's a view of the Bilston Holt station back on the layout with the added lamps. Another kit I dealt with at this time was the ratio loading gauge kit. Even though it basically only had 2 parts, it still managed to live up to the ratio tradition of being fiddly and difficult. Cutting out the etched brass part was very tricky, as it is hair fine, and gluing it to the plastic part, well, as usual, with ratio there was no actual interlock, no guidance, you just had to do your best to glue it on, with superglue in my case. The brass part should be black, so I did my best to paint it. The next problem I faced was how I was going to place this gauge on the layout. I tried it for size and found that basically the bottom of the plastic pole needed to be on the ground. So in order to be able to support it, I glued a piece of thin piano wire to the base, so this could be stuck into my foam board to support the gauge. I painted over the piano wire to match it to the main post as closely as possible so it wouldn't be too obvious. Another kit I assembled at this point was this P&D Marsh white metal platform water crane. There were only 4 parts, but with no instructions at all, I wasn't quite sure how they were supposed to go together. I checked various pictures of real cranes. Actually, it seems sometimes the spigot was behind the main crane upright and sometimes it was in front, so there's not necessarily any one right way. I came to the conclusion the P&D Marsh kit was probably intended to have the spigot on the square piece, although I suppose you could have done it the other way round. Once assembled, I painted the crane. Gunmetal for the base and spigot, LMS crimson for the main crane, and brown for the hose. And here's the crane in place on the Colville platform at the top right there. Finally, I assembled a couple of ratio single-post signal kits. These also had parts I couldn't get off the sprue without breaking them, the little handles at the base. Even cutting with my sharpest tool, they both broke. Also, the parts didn't really fit together. Unusually for ratio, they actually provided pins on the bottom of the upper shafts to fit into holes in the base section. But the pins wouldn't fit into the holes, as the holes were too small and way too shallow relative to the pins. So I had to make my own holes in order to get the pieces to go together. As I'm sure you've gathered by now, I'm not really all that pleased with ratio kits. As I've said, they do make some good parts, but putting them together is hard work. Still, these made usable signals. I used decals, which I bought separately for the signal blades. I made the lenses, which go behind the signal blades, so we would have a lamp showing through them. I made those lenses by setting drops of CA glue into the holes and then painting after the drops dried clear. Ratio don't give you anything for the lenses, they're just holes in the parts. But you obviously somehow want to make some equivalent of a coloured lens there. And here's one of the ratio signals on the layout. And that's it for this part. More coming soon, more scenics, some new rolling stock, and more running.